Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Brian.
The news seems to be heating up, one event after another. Sooner had we learned about Amanda Cox than she got moved out of the headlines by the prisoner swap in Israel, and then the Kurdish problems, and now this morning, just when we thought things were calming down again, we hear that the final outpost of Gaddafi in Libya has been taken, and Gaddafi appears to have been killed. It reminded me of a quotation from Harold Macmillan from way back, somebody asked him what kept him going as Prime Minister, and this was a dinner party, of course, he said, "Events, my dear boy, events."
Events.
But they really seem to be getting faster and faster, and I think they provide a very interesting perspective on the way the world is changing, because they all really have something to do with the authority of the nation state. And it seems as though it's just one after another.
Let's face it, excuse me.
Things that couldn't have happened not so long ago.
If you took a synopsis of the events in the Middle East in the Arab Spring and somehow printed it last January, no one would have believed it. I mean, it's truly remarkable what has happened. I mean, it defies description, and to have it happen so quickly, and truly with such contagion as everybody had suspected when it first began. I mean, it's really a remarkable display of how the nation-state's powers have eroded, and how cultural and religious influences, perhaps as well as other influences, are able to just jump across borders. It's almost like a biological agent. It's amazing.
We're getting close to the end of the calendar year when people usually review what's happened in the past year. And I imagine there'll be other things between now and then. It's going to be quite an amazing review this year. And nation states everywhere seem to be very worried about their ability to control what goes on within their borders, having more and more trouble and reacting against the problems. And in most cases, I think one has to say that they're reacting against the problems in ways that they probably won't be able to keep up.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, I think you see it manifested even in the reactions to the failing global economy, with what's going on with the Europeans, and they're constantly discussing. I mean, how many times have they said Greece? I mean, it's like it's back in the old days. We've always killed the number 2 Al-Qaeda figure. We must have killed the number 2 figure 4 or 5 times. And now, how many times have they come up with a solution for the Greek plan, for the Greek debt crisis? And it never seems to end. And it all comes back with what they have to face at home. The local constituencies, the Germans or the French, just draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to cross this. It's a very interesting problem to face, and it's almost like as things are becoming more compact, as more globalization trends are being manifested, so that even the man or woman in the street are seeing it. What's happening is, on the other hand, on the reverse, the nation-state control is fracturing, and they just simply can't keep up with it, and they're helpless.
And the figure given in the news yesterday morning for the number of cities that now were seeing demonstrations against the status quo was 900 cities. I haven't seen a list of the 900, so we have to take the figure on trust, but certainly it's amazing how this tendency to protest, for people to just come out on the streets and protest.
Well, that's another very good example. It started in New York, and then it jumped quickly to Washington, D.C., and then it moved to other cities throughout the United States. And then bingo, next thing it was in Berlin, it was in Rome, it was in London, it was in Australia, on and on and on. The same problems.
In places like Italy than most other places.
From what I read, the Italian civil strife in connection with these protests was the worst violence since the end of the Second World War in civil protests.
What does this mean for the nation state? We have no other way of managing international affairs except through the nation state representation in the United Nations. And the United Nations is already trying to deal with the problem of a non-state applying to be a member, which it has to consider next. I think it's coming up on their agenda next month.
Well,
so that, in some ways, will be a test case for us to see how much our ideas about what a nation-state is and to what extent it's a total political monopoly within a territory, how much those ideas have changed.
Well, let me ask you a question, if I may. I've only seen something like this that has remotely approached this, and that was the situation that occurred in the former Soviet Union, when the country fell apart, and all of a sudden the former republics actually became separate countries. Chaos ensued, and a vacuum of great magnitude came into being, and one of the parties that stepped into the breach was crime. I mean, I'm wondering, when we look at this chaos, and chaos may be too strong a word to use in connection with describing the global situation, but maybe not. When we look at this disorganization or disorder on a global scale, who is happy right now? If we think about that, who's looking at this going, finally?
Crime is much worse now than it's ever been, even though crime has always been a part of urban life. And one expects the amount of crime to grow because cities have grown, and the number of cities increases, and half the world's population is in cities, and so on. So there's bound to be more crime. But in fact, it seems to me that crime is growing beyond what one would expect simply from the consideration of those first variables that one would think of. Well, in the news yesterday, I think it was, there was something about how many $1 billion it will cost California to execute 23 people.
Yes.
Over the course of, I forget how many years.
Yes. And this is
people they have on death row. And it came into the news because one person opted to go on to death row. I don't know how it was he had the option, because prisoners are looked after better on death row than in normal prisons. But then, of course, most of them, in fact, don't get executed. They get the typical length of stay is something like 20 years before the execution is carried out.
Correct.
And it costs the taxpayer a ridiculous amount of money for a punishment that doesn't really make very much sense if half of them are going to be let out again, and presumably have difficulty becoming well-adapted citizens.
Well, I'm just thinking, when you see a vacuum of authority or a weakening of the institutions that traditionally have exerted authority on a global scale, all right, whether it be the government institutions, whether it be, I suppose in some sense, even religious institutions or cultural institutions. I mean, I tend to look at organizations that are already extant and can be proven to cross borders, who are very authoritative, who have blind allegiance within their group, who are capable of mobilizing quickly to take advantage of situations that are typically chaotic. And I only come up with a couple of obvious answers. Right? Organized crime is one, perhaps certain terrorist groups, although many of them have seemingly been at least greatly weakened. But, or even, I hate to say this, I'm in the wrong place, but perhaps even corporations. A corporation would be similarly situated as well to take advantage of something like this.
There's an increasing amount of, should we call it, deviant behavior, and it's most obvious in the countries which are experiencing the fastest growth. The child that was run over in China the other day, that sort of thing. That we don't have a way of containing this enormous increase in crime, and the reason that it's happening is that the quality of social life generally is changing, and that seems to be the last thing that is being seriously getting any attention as a product of globalization. And I mean, partly because we all think, like Mrs. Thatcher, that there's no such thing as society, there's just people. Mm-hmm. So we don't look at the quality of the actual interaction that makes up society. So it's difficult to see how this is going to develop, because it's almost certainly going to develop without it being planned. Our planning objectives are way behind the
events.
The society we live in that we should be planning for is actually changing.
Now, in the past, we've had discussions, and I believe that you've articulated a view that we collectively, as humans alive, we're at this almost 7 billionth person. I keep hearing that person is going to be born sometime imminently, but the 7 billion of us are moving, albeit perhaps slowly or fitfully, towards some sort of global society, global culture. Is this something that I've heard you say this? Is this correct, or my imagination?
I seem to remember that the 7 billionth living person is expected on October 31st, but I'm not sure how reliable these estimates are or who will be counting at the time. The point, I think, is that maybe there'll be a global community, but it won't be a homogeneous global community. Mm-hmm. And there will be continuing movement of people. There'll be continuing redistribution of that population. And so there'll be lots of concentrations of population, and the concentrations will move so that there'll be sub-communities within the global community. And one of the factors that will drive this redistribution is that we keep on getting interested in new resources. And the resources, if they're natural resources, are distributed. Each new resource is distributed in a different way. So if all those resources that we know are in the middle of Afghanistan suddenly become an object of interest in the international market, that's going to completely change the way Afghanistan figures in the international market. Mm-hmm. And if solar energy continues to come down in price, the Persian Gulf will begin to figure in a very different way in the international market.
Right, right.
And I think that if the global population does continue to grow, but to a diminishing extent, up to somewhere like 10 billion, or probably, I think the pessimists say 12 billion and the optimists say 9 billion, and then even off on a new plateau, then the big problem, of course, is how can we continue to have economic growth, and how can we live without economic growth if we don't have population growth? And I think actually the growth will continue to be driven by the reconfiguration of the redistribution of population and the growth of sub-communities here and there in succession on a continuing basis in different parts of the world.
And do you think the sub-communities will follow the resources?
I think that some of them will, but I think that it's not the
primary driver.
It's not only natural resources that drive the economy. Mm-hmm. It's other sorts of innovation as well. So it won't always be Cupertino. It may be some similar place in Korea or China. Mm-hmm. If things continue to become more and more fluid, it will be easier for people to switch not only from one part of Europe to another part of Europe, and not just from one country to another country, but from particular concentrations of economic development to others.
But that requires, in turn, a tremendous amount of suppleness and flexibility on the part of the individual.
But I think that that's what's happening. I mean, I think that the The barriers between language communities are becoming less significant. The barriers between cultural communities are becoming less significant.
That's a good point.
But the problem is the increase of crime at the same time, and the fact that there's also a continuing redistribution of international crime, which, despite the efforts of the CIA and the FBI in relation to the supposed attempted bombing of the Saudi ambassador in Washington a while ago. We seem to have no way of and Interpol's connection with that, we seem to have no way of dealing with. I think our time is up.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. And we'll talk again.